So it's about to talk.
Indeed.
So today we are honored to welcome outstanding speaker of the United Kingdom, Mr. Pettigrew from University of Cambridge. So how do we essentially work in the management of first ever case of open donor management in our ICU? This topic is quite fascinating topic. Before starting this talk, would you like to make a introduction?
先生、ありがとうございました。本日は本当にありがとうございます。私もチームMr.Gavinで、移植の、留学中の女子である、こういう時間をくれることにガビン先生は、スコットランド出身ですが、ケンブリッジでメインで、移植家として、その中で、日本のように、あまりその、検体からの、移植っていうのが、あまりされてなかった時代、移植で、ハーベストに行っているような時代を経て、今のかなり効率的に移植を行えるを整えた先駆者の方がいます。その中でデータをアカデミックペーパーを出しながら、データを出しながら、皆さんの理解を得ながら変えてきたという、そういうイギリスの10年の世界がなと思いますので、ぜひ我々でできる環境の変化に参考になるようなお話になるんじゃないかなと思いますけど、英語でお話しするんですけれども、スライド1枚ぐらいしたら簡単に翻訳するような形で進めさせていただきたいと思いますし、エミ先生もモノローグというよりも皆さんお話しして、日本の状況というのを分かった上でお話ししたいというありますので、ようやく私が練習するときに、日本語でも話せるので、ご質問いただければ、で、できたらなと思います。はい、あと、これ、アーカイブで、もし、ここから、じゃあ、よろしくお願いします。
Thank you, and thank you very much for the kind invite to talk. Maybe before we start, can I ask how many in the audience are clinicians and how many are actually transplant coordinators, just to get a feel for the audience? Doctors? Nurses? Or? Okay, and so anybody transplant coordinators? Presumably not. You're very welcome. Thank you. So I thought what I'd start with is just to have a quick overview of how deceased organ donation is organised in the UK, and I think that's very pertinent to what happened recently. It's actually a service that's commissioned centrally by a body called NHS Blood and Transplant. And in that situation, potential donors in ITU are referred to a special team of nurses, the specialist nurses in organ donation, who are employed again by NHSBT and work out with ITU. And the SNODs attend and speak to the family and assess that donor for organs and then get consent from the family. And then the organs are offered on a national basis to the top ranked individual. I'll talk about that in a minute. There we are.
So, 移動提供を管理してまして、移植もハーベストも全部この NHSBT という母体でコントロールして、ドナーの家族には IT、集中治療科から紹介を受けたそのスノーズっていう、働きはだと思うんですけども、その移植のコーディネーターとして、これにご協力方がご家族とお話しされて、現在に至るというプロセスを踏 その一番下にあるコースチームっていうのが、また別途その国で、ハーベストの外科のチームが組まれていて、なので、全部シフトしてで、
Can I ask, what's ITU stands for?
Oh, sorry. ITU is Intensive Therapy Unit.
It's the same as ICU.
Same as ICU. We call it ITU for whatever reason in the UK, sorry. And in terms of the consent, that's quite important. Until quite recently, we had what was called an opt-in service. And essentially then, you can explain that, can't you? Oh, just in the interest of time. And the crucial thing about what happens in the UK is that if the population are encouraged to sign in for the organ donor register, that again is maintained by NHS Blood and Transplant. And as of August last year, as you can see, 42% of the population were on the organ donor register. We have moved to an opt-out service just recently, a soft opt-out. And in theory, with an opt-out system, unless you declare in advance that you wish not to be an organ donor, in theory, you are then eligible for organ donation. But it's a soft opt-out, so we don't really enforce that very strongly.
過去には、オプトインという日本として臓器提供の意思があるかどうかの確認をするシステムになっていて、で、その意思とは別に今、家族の意思も尊重される中で、42% ぐらいの意思提供率がある。直近、今度ソフトオプトアウトっていうシステムにで、これは、手分けをしなかったら、的には臓器提供の意思があるとみなされるという。臓器提供してほしくないという意思を示さないだけが臓器提供の意思だというところであるんですが、ソフトが出ている理由は、いざその提供するような場面になったときには、もう一度再度、家族や本人の直近のファミリーをコミュニケーションであるので、もう意思を示してなかったら、必ずどうなりないという、のではないですっていう。
Thank you. And here's actually what's happened in the last 10 years or so in terms of consent. And the important thing is you can see that the referral rate has increased incrementally over the last 10 years. And the green line is the times where the specialist nurses and organ donation attended. And the important thing with their attendance is that that seems to have an improvement in getting family consent. And it's quite different, I think, in the UK than in Japan. We approach the family for organ donation. We don't wait for the family to approach us. And it's mandated upon ICU clinicians to actually approach the family.
日本とイギリスの大きな違いは、集中治療と、あとそのドナー提供に特化した看護師が必ず家族に意向を伺うというのが、課されているというところが違うところかと思います。で、実際にリファラルレート、要は紹介されるレートと、ドナー提供の看護師がいたレートを見ても相関性がありますので、やはりこういうドナーの家族とコミュニケーションする看護師が、市役所が一定時間をかけたしているところが、現在のドナーの動画につながっているとは言える。
And okay, it's just worth mentioning, currently about 70% of families who are approached say yes to organ donation. So a very high number will respond favourably. This slide very briefly shows when the different devolved nations, that's Scotland, Wales, England, introduced an opt-out system. And you can see quite recent for England and Scotland. The introduction of the opt-out actually coincided with the COVID pandemic. So that actual introduction was lost with all the noise of the pandemic. So in essence, we've got actually two systems working in the UK. You can opt in to the register, or you can opt out. And basically, briefly, this slide shows that the vast majority opt in for organ donation, and a very small minority opt out.
青いバーが意思を示して紫がドナーになりたくないという意思を示しているグラフなんですけども、見ての通りほとんどの方はオプティントに意思を提供しているというのが見えます。で、先ほどのスライドは各地域でいつそのオプトアウトになったかを示したんですが、コロナでなかなかその制度の変化に伴うノイズというのが
And then when it comes to actually retrieving the organs, we have a dedicated organ retrieval service that's funded by NHSBT, and we've got 10 abdominal teams and 6 cardiothoracic teams, and they are tasked to retrieve organs from any hospital in the country, and it's based upon a geographical basis.
国を地域で分けて、10の腹部外科と6の頭部外科のチームが過去の地図で見えるように、チーム編成として常に
That's where the teams are based, just out of interest. And since the introduction in 2010, you can see that we've had a stepwise increase in organ donation. And that's predicted to increase. We did have a hiatus with the COVID pandemic, but again, we're now getting busier and busier as we recover from the pandemic. And this slide very briefly shows when the abdominal teams are present and when the cardiothoracic teams are present. But we are busy, and what this slide shows is the amount of times teams are out. And so the typical average is that 5 of the abdominal teams are out together on one day. Okay. I think it's worthwhile just discussing how organs are offered. We view them as an NHS resource, and then the organs are offered according to a national algorithm to who is deemed to be the top individual in the country for that organ. And it does mean there, for example, a kidney that's received or retrieved in Aberdeen, which is in the far north of the country, it's quite possible that kidney will be offered to somebody in Scotland or in Wales or in London, and will travel down to that particular recipient. And we've got different allocation algorithms that are in use for each organ, and I'll describe them briefly shortly. But the algorithms and the offering scheme tries to ensure that organs are offered fairly and equitably.
検体の中で臓器というのは、そのナショナルシステムの中での財産として、全国のリストの中から、フェアに、公平に分配されることになっていて、すなわち、日本で言ったら北海道で出た検体の臓器が、別々に一つの検体から出た、それぞれの臓器を並ばれているに。
And so, for example, the kidney, we have a whole list of several thousand patients waiting for kidneys, and kidneys are offered according to 2 tiers. Tier A are those patients who are very highly sensitized and very hard to match, and that's actually a very small proportion, and they get offered as a priority over everybody else because of the recognition that they might well wait otherwise 7-8 years for a transplant. Do you want to explain that? Sorry.
腎臓に対して言うと、大きくTIA と TIB と分かれていて、TIA とか組織管理とかも含めて、なかなか適合しにくい方々をリストして、この方々はプライオリティされている。ただ、全体の数としてはこのTIA は非常に少ない。
And so then there are relatively few Tier A patients that have to be very highly sensitized. So most are offered through the Tier B scheme. And the algorithm considers all these factors here, and it has an equation, and you put all the factors in against that kidney, and it comes up with a top named individual. And the one thing that was in that thing is called the donor and recipient risk index. That's one of the 8 factors that's considered. And essentially what that means is that we try and categorize the quality of the donor and the recipient. If you're a very healthy young recipient, you're R1. The more elderly recipients with perhaps medical comorbidities, they're R4. And similarly, that's the same. If you're a young, healthy donor, you're a D1 donor. If you're very elderly with other health problems, you're D4. And we try and, as of 2019 with the new match, we try and match them so that D4 kidneys go to R4 recipients, and the R4 kidneys, sorry, did I say D4? D4 goes to R4 and D1 goes to R1. And that graph just shows how the new scheme tries to put the D4 kidneys into the R4 recipients. Sorry. I'll just skip by that in the interest of time. Worthwhile just saying that they are offered to a named person sequentially. If that kidney is turned down by 5 centres, it gets offered to this thing called the fast track scheme to all centres. The liver is a very intriguing system. It took many years to develop and come up with the plan. Livers are allocated according to a transplant benefit score. And just to explain that, you look at the expected survival of that liver patient waiting for a liver. That's the blue here. And then you look at what happens to that patient if they receive that liver. And you obviously hope that you'll see a survival benefit, because we know that people die without a liver. And so the liver is allocated to the person in the country who we think gains most benefit. In other words, this area here, the biggest area for that individual gets offered that liver. Yeah, right. Have a go at that. And this, what it actually involves. We can see here that the dark line at the top is the transplant waiting list. The light bars are the number of transplants, and then the bars at the bottom are the number of donors. And I think the important thing are 2 things about this. You can see prior to the pandemic, we were managing to do more transplants, and unlike most other countries in the world, our national waiting list was falling. That obviously got hit by the pandemic. That's the pandemic, that dip there. And we are gradually recovering, but as a consequence of that hit, you can see that our waiting list has risen again.
青がドナーで、グレーが移植で、ドットのラインが待機患者ですけども、コロナの前は待機患者が少なくなったんですけども、コロナを経て待機患者が増えている。
And we break it down, the big difference in the UK is that the silver bars here are living donors, the two blue bars are deceased donors, the dark blue being donation after brain death, so patients declared brain dead, and the light blue is donation after circulatory death, DCD. And if you add the two up, you can see that deceased donors far outnumber living donors.
ここはイギリスと日本の違いになりますけれども、グレーが生体患者で、青、両方の濃いの両方とも、現在のドナーになりますけれども、DBD というのが脳幹死後、脳死後、DCD は循環転死後ということになりますけれども、要は循環転死の脳死も両方合わせても圧倒的に生体よりも多いのが分かるかなと思いますけど、なので、そういう前提状況が日本にございます。
And to provide a comparison to Japan, on the left here are the number of living donors per million population. And you can see that roughly equivalent, although the UK does slightly more. But clearly, we do far greater numbers of deceased donors. And the reality is that actually the mainstay of the transplant activity in the UK is through deceased donation. And here's what's happened to the kidney transplants performed in the country. Again, you can see over the years a general increase. We got hit by the pandemic, and again, just gradually building back up. And as a consequence, the waiting list is beginning to rise again. So. Having said that, I think we are very proud of what we've achieved over the years. Obviously, COVID was a problem. But it is worth highlighting that in the UK, there are 71,000 patients on renal replacement therapy, so requiring some form of support for their kidneys, and of which actually more than half have a transplant. So we've got 31,000 patients on dialysis and more with a working transplants.
腎代替療法が必要になる患者さんが1000人いるわけなんですけれども、その半分以上の 56% が移植を受けるのに対して、44% が透析という、ここの圧倒的な日本の違いになります。
And in comparison, there's something like 350,000 patients in Japan on dialysis. Okay. So I think we've done very well, but I think it's always in a state of flux, things develop and change in transplantation, and I think we do face more challenges. The donor pool is changing. We've got a reduction in brain dead donors. We've got a more elderly population in ITU. The incidence of end-stage kidney failure is continuing to rise in the UK. And I've stressed how organs are a national resource. How do we ensure that we actually have fairness in distribution, that we get equity of access? Wake up.
移植の置かれる課題というのは刻一刻と変わっていて、イギリスにおいても今のチャレンジというのは脳死が提供できることだったり、集中治療室での患者さん年齢が上がっていたりっていうところがありますけれども、常にイギリスで強調されている点としては、やはりそのドナーの臓器というのは国の資産であり、公平に使われるべきというところに根幹を置いて、課題として検討がされている。このことは本当にすごくてですね、日々、イギリスの医療体制ってすごく ルールが頻繁に変わるんですけども、これ、医療機関としてはすごい大変なんですけども、一方で、そういう変化に、リーズに対応して、できるだけ、公正性のいい多くなるようにというところは、
And just to demonstrate that change, over the years, to try and meet the demand, we've used increasingly elderly donors. So our deceased donor pool now, about 40% of our pool are from donors who are over 60.
ドナーの年齢が高かったということはすごい日本の場合は非常に関係があると思うんです。先生のお仕事の一つとしては、いかに高齢のドナーからの、好成績の移植を成立させるのかっていうので、どのような高齢者からのドナー臓器が成功につながるのかっていうところを調べると、この後それに元になるプールの年齢の時代強くて。
And this is a report from one of the UK charities that was just released last year. And it's quite a frightening report because what it predicts is perhaps this very massive increase in the UK in the dialysis population in the next 10 years, as much as fourfold.
次の10年、健康疾患者が4倍になるというレポートがあって、これがどんなに公正性の危機かというところがある。
And what it also suggests to try and mitigate against this increase are 4 different approaches. The first 3 approaches are centered around about better diagnosis, better management, and the third one being perhaps the introduction of new agents such as SGLT inhibitors. But they all cost money. The fourth approach is to increase transplantation. And you can see how much transplantation saves. In the UK, a transplant saves about £25,000 annually over the cost of dialysis.
この腎不全患者さんの危機、増加の危機に対して、4つの対処法が示されていて、診断とマネージと、あと治療選択、SGLT1 をすることが出ているので、これらが、みんな上に向かってる産地で、開催って費用対効果ですけども、コストがかかるのに対して、一般的になったと思うと、それが、移植に関しては非常にコストセービングだ。
Despite the pressures, you can see that this is the discard rate, and despite everything we can do, we still actually discard about over 10% of the kidneys that are retrieved, and that value seems to be increasing despite the pressures.
こんなに貴重な検体になっている一方で、ハーベストした腎が使われない数っていうのもやはり。
And that's to say, despite this waiting list that continues to rise. So, as I say, we have a national allocation system, so you would think that would mean that everybody gets equal access. But if I show you this slide shows the waiting times for the patients at each of the different centres in the UK. There are 23 transplant centres.
移植をするカーベストに移植をするセンターがこれだけあるんですけども、ナショナル臓器が再開されているとは言っても、やはり移植センターが最終的に移植をするかどうかを決めているので、この絵を見ると、ケンブリッジは非常にウェイティングリストが短い。なので、イエスに出ると、来た時に対して植えます。
So in Cambridge currently, our patients wait less than a year, but in other centres they might wait 2 or 3 years, and that's despite national offering. Okay, that's the most recent figures. And you can look at that in terms of actually doing fancy statistics that we do at NHSBT, do funnel plots, and you can see that Cambridge are D, and that's our median wait time. So we are, in Cambridge, our patients wait a significantly less time for transplant than other centres. And what that means is if you look at what happens to the patients when they're listed, and you look at the 3-year outcomes of the patients, So once they're listed and you look at 3 years later and you see what the outcome is, this graph shows again each of the centres and it shows what happens to these patients. The dark blue being they're transplanted, the light blue means they're still waiting, and the white and the grey are either removed because they become too unwell or they're died. And you can see that very different outcomes for patients at 3 years depending on the centre they're listed.
先ほどのように、ケンブリッジの待機時間が短いことで、3年後の医療とか病気もだいぶ違って、その移植やウェイティングが短い。
And what that means, if you look geographically, there are differences in how many patients get transplanted, and that is, as I say, at odds with the whole concept of national allocation.
地図で見ても、それなりに変動があると思います。
And it does beg the question, well, why is there this difference between different centres? And this is, I think, something called the risk communication tool. It's available to patients. You can put in the patient's details in terms of their age, how sensitised they are, and you put in their transplant centre. And that tool will give you a prediction for what will happen to that patient. So if I do that for a patient, and we say this centre, the blue is the x-axis is a year's waiting, and the blue is still waiting. The green is transplanted. The mauve colour is removed, and the top colour, the brown colour, is dead.
さっき1個前のスライドで見せてたのは、もう患者さんも入れることができるんですけど、自分の組織のマッチだとか、年齢だとかを入れると、その一つのセンターで、自分がどれくらい多分この臓器を待たなきゃいけないかっていうのが想定される最短で、それを各センターでやると、特にこう、経年齢ごとに、どれくらい移植がされる方、待たなきゃいけない。亡くなる方が出てくる数が見えるんですけど、この多分、他のセンターでの見てくれると、それは移植センターごとのそのバリエーションがある。
And if you put the exact same patient, but put in Cambridge as a transplant centre, you can see green what happens, the difference. And it does raise a philosophical question. Should we allow patients to register at different transplant centres? That doesn't happen in the UK currently. And in interest of time, I'll maybe skip on, but essentially, the reason this difference exists is because different centres are more comfortable accepting organs, and we get different decline rates in different centres of the same organs. And in Cambridge, we use quite a few organs that have been declined elsewhere, and that's why that difference exists. Just to say that we're happy to accept kidneys declined elsewhere, and there are three, I think, important differences within the UK in terms of how that impacts upon overall acceptance on utilisation. It depends on that centre's appetite for taking DCD kidneys, or elderly kidneys, or kidneys that have been declined by lots of other centres.
その違いが何かっていう分析をすると、DCD、循環的仕事っていうのが基本的には臓器のクオリティとして下に見られることが多いので、その循環的仕事の臓器を入れるとか、それから高齢者からのドナー、高齢者のドナーからの臓器を入れるとか、あと、さっきも申しました、1回のオファーで受け入れられなかった臓器を国会再検討する、この3要素がキーになる。
And very briefly, this just shows Cambridge. The dark grey is DCD donors. We do far more DCD donors than other centres, and many more than brain dead donors or living donors.
この青が循環性脂肪の要は DCD の脂肪のドナーを取ってます。
One of the things I think is quite different in the UK is when we have a DCD donor, and it's obviously a very big feature of the UK transplant portfolio, we will wait a minimum of 3 or 4 hours from withdrawal of treatment until we abandon that retrieval if the patient doesn't arrest. Now, normally we would expect the patient to arrest quite quickly, but in about a third of cases that doesn't happen, and we have to wait, and at some point you have to say that's long enough. But most other countries, they wait 1 hour, we'll wait 3 or 4 hours.
循環停止後のハーブストに関しては、治療停止されてから、多くの国では1時間ぐらい待って、循環停止を迎えなかったら、もうそのハーブス自体がやめられることがある。一方で、ケンブリッジは、UK では3時間、ケンブリッジは4時間ぐらい待ってから、チームが待っていますので、それもできるだけそのドナー提供の意思があったはずだからの臓器がちゃんと提供されるように努力する。
I'm just in the interest of time. We know that if we wait 3 or 4 hours, as opposed to waiting 1 hour, that increases the number of transplants we do by 30%.
その1時間を3時間と4時間にすることで、30% の臓器提供増加が見込めるっていうのが分かって、多分この後時間がかけているか分からないんですけど、3時間待っても臓器の定着率だったり、患者さんの予後に関係がないということを思ってで、なので、できるだけ多く伝えられるということをしているがゆえに、研究では、ウェイトリストのタイムに時間って多くから。
If you do wait longer, if you wait more than an hour, the donor does become unstable because they have a slow progression towards death. And in that point, they're much more liable to become hypertensive or oliguric over that prolonged point. And that's what that diagram shows. Oh, have you? Okay, you're ahead of me. But the important thing is what we looked at in Cambridge was, didn't matter if in that 3 or 4 hour window that patient became unstable. It didn't make any telling impact on the graft outcome. And the only 2 variables were cold ischemic time and donor age. You said that too, have you? No.
だから3時間、4時間待って変わらないっていうことが分かるとともに、唯一の予後に比する因子は、補欠時間とドナーの年齢というところを分かる。
This graph just shows that relationship between age and EGFR. And it does mean when we set up the retrieval service nationally, we mandated that all teams wait a minimum of 3 hours. Okay? And that's what's happened over the years, in the last 10 years. Most donors do arrest quite quickly because, after all, we were drawing life-supporting treatment in the expectation that they do die. But you can see a small number progress longer out to about 3 hours, and you can see the impact it's had. The darker colours are those kidneys that have been transplanted from donors that have died beyond an hour from withdrawal of treatment.
治療終了から時間になっていて、見ての通り、30分以内ぐらいに大体心停止を迎えている。とは言っても、やはり3時間までの間に、一定数の心停止を迎えて、ドナー提供に行ったという感じがあって、で、下が今度移植されている臓器の分布ですけども、この濃い青になっているところっていうのが、2時間以上待った循環停止の患者さんからの臓器提供で移植生着している方々ということなので、この2時間、3時間、4時間待つことがいいということを。
But again, the crucial thing is, if you look at donors that arrest beyond 2 hours, that's the dark brown, the light brown, it makes no impact on graft outcome.
3時間でも4時間でも、生着率には変わらない。
I'll skip on this in the interest of time, I think. I mentioned that one of the things we do is take elderly donors, and we have a very big focus on DCD donation. I think it's worthwhile just touching upon the outcomes for DCD kidneys. How do they fare compared to a DBD kidney? This paper from Dom and our group, essentially what it showed is that obviously donor age is a very big predictor of outcomes. the more elderly the donor, the more marginal the kidney. We don't expect it to last long. But that compared to the age, everything else is pretty insignificant. Things like cold ischemic time, HLA mismatch is pretty insignificant. And then now with many thousand kidneys with long-term follow-up, we can show quite confidently that there is no difference in outcome between a brain-dead kidney and a kidney from a DCD donor.
長いフォローアップをしても、一番最後に見たのが、脳死化提供と循環停止化提供で、全くその差がない。他にいろんな要素を見られる。唯一、予後に寄与しているのは、ドナーの年齢。
And we can do that with a simple Kaplan-Meier analysis, and you can see that the outcomes for DCD and DBD in the UK in the graph there are very similar. And we get a 10-year graft survival of 75%. And if you compare the survival in the US, at 5 years, it's 73%. So we do better than the US.
メーカーと比べても、10年生存率長いですし、脳死化提供でも、循環心停止化提供でも変わらない。
But it does raise a question about the challenge of using the older donor. And this is the graph again, just to highlight that of all the factors, it's the donor age that relates to the expectation of outcome of that kidney.
そのドナーの年齢だけがやっぱり寄与する医師なんだったら、そのドナーの年齢に対してどうやって再生できるのかっていうのが。
And that leads to the kind of great paradox in transplantation. We know that the majority of people who die in ITU are elderly, and hence that elderly population has real potential to increase transplant rates and donor rates. However, against that, we know that you're twice as likely to lose a kidney if you have it from an older recipient, or an older donor, sorry. And in particular, you have a higher incidence of primary non-function, about twice what you have with a normal kidney. Primary non-function is when you put a kidney in and this simply never functions. And the chastening thing about primary non-function is that it does have an association with a very significant mortality in that recipient.
先ほどドナーの年齢が一番協力が高いという一方で、実際のところドナープールですね、ITU の患者さんの多くは高齢化していて、かつ、すなわちその高齢の患者さんから出た腎臓を使わなければいけない状況にある一方で、ここで実際問題60歳以上の患者さんのからの移植は2倍定着率が半分、制約半分ですし、プライマリーファンクションを植えた後、一度も腎機能が回復しないということなんですけど、それよりも得られない率が2倍ですし、実際そのプライマリーファンクションの患者さんというのは、致死率が高いので、やはりそのどうやって高齢の中の腎臓でもいい結果を出すのかというところが、研究のなどで行わ
And this just shows it graphically. And the risk of dying if you've got a kidney that doesn't work is particularly grave if you're elderly, if you just focus on the lower part. So if you're over 60 and you get a kidney that doesn't work, that's a green bar. Your expected mortality is about 30% at 1 year.
プライマリーファクションのリシピアントが高齢になったときに、やっぱりその生存率が最も強く怖いからね。
And so there's been all sorts of things over the years to try and have a marker that will distinguish of the elderly kidneys, what's a good quality kidney that you can transplant safely, and what's a poor kidney that you should discard.
なので、高齢ドナーの腎臓をどういう基準で良いものと悪いもの、そういう量が良いものと悪いもの、見分けられるのかっていうのが、治療命題になっている。なんでこれを研究している
And again, this is what this graph shows. Basically, it's those largely the D4, that's the more marginal donor kidneys that get discarded.
D4 一番リスクが高いドナー腎臓黄色がどんな感じなのかの。
And I'll show this very quickly. This is a slide looking at 6-month activity in the UK prior to the COVID pandemic. But in essence, of donors over 60, of which there were several hundred offers in a 6-month period, about 800 offers, less than half were actually transplanted. So that's almost 500 kidneys that were actually retrieved in a 6-month period, but that weren't used. And you can just imagine what impact that could have in the waiting list population if we could use them effectively. Now in Cambridge, what we've done over the years is use this thing called pre-implantation biopsy analysis. We've got a pathology service that's available 24 hours a day, and we do it routinely. And so almost invariably, any kidney from a donor over 65, we will biopsy, and we will take a paraffin section, and then it's graded according to the Remutzi system. Remutzi was an Italian nephrologist who came up with a score, and the score is a surrogate for what is thought to be an adequate nephron mass that you transplant. And he showed that this score had a correlation with outcome. And the score is composed of 4 components, looking at the various aspects of the kidney, the vessels, the tubules, the glomeruli, and the connective tissue. And they're scored from 0 to 3, with 3 being the most severe, and you get a score of 12 as your cumulative score. And in Remutzi's seminal paper in the New England Journal, what he showed is they've used that system, they got that outcome in terms of graft survival in the red line there. And you compare the outcomes to the transplants that happened contemporaneously in centres in his region but didn't have access to biopsy. You see the black line, and that equates to a difference of about 20% at 3 years in kidney graft survival. That's very quick. So we used it. Remutzi was very much focused on brain-dead DBD kidneys. We've used the score to confirm that it's equally applicable to DCD kidneys, and that we've shown in this paper that if you implant either a DCD or a DBD kidney that scores up to 4, we get the lines at the top. But if you implant a kidney singly that scores more than 4, let's say it scores 5 or 6, that's a kidney that's got more damage. You can see that actually that does have quite a significant impact on the expected graft outcome. This graph just shows the relationship between age of the donor and the Remutzi score, and clearly there's a relationship. As you get more elderly, you expect more damage. But what it also demonstrates is it's quite a loose relationship, that we can see kidneys that from elderly donors that have got very good scores, and conversely we can get kidneys from younger donors that have got very bad scores and got quite severe disease. So in Cambridge, the current practice is we will biopsy the elderly kidneys. If they score 1 to 4, we put them in as a single transplant. If they score 5 or 6, we put them in as 2 transplants together. So the 2 kidneys from the one donor has a dual transplant. And that means we have been able to use kidneys from DCD donors who are over 70, as we show in this paper here. And we use a biopsy to guide us. This is the kidneys we did, either a single transplant on the left or a dual transplant. And you can see the dual transplant scored more poorly in the biopsy.
なので、このスコアを使って、60歳のドナーでも追着するということが言えて、で、
This one, yes.
一つの腎臓を入れる場合と、二つの腎臓を入れる場合で、バランスがした。
But the take-home message, by using that approach, either as a single transplant, if you've got a favourable score, or a dual transplant, if it's less favourable, we get very good outcomes. That's the EGFR at 6 months and a year. And in the UK generally, we're actually quite amenable to doing transplants for elderly kidneys as dual transplants. Here's a national experience. You can see that actually looking at donors over 65, we get better outcomes with a dual transplant than a single transplant, and particularly the 1 year for the dual transplant.
65歳以上のドナーからの腎においては、2つ使った方がサバイバルとかもいいですし、1年後の腎機能を見てもいい。
I think maybe we should stop there because it's almost an hour. So maybe stop there and we'll come back to questions and I'll come to the conclusion at the end. You think so? Yeah.
ここまでで何か質問とかありますか?
Well, I have one question about the surgical retrieval fee in the UK. You mentioned about surgical retrieval.
Yes, indeed.
And are they full-time employed by the NHS?
Yes, they're not employed, well, they're employed by the trust, but they're funded through central government, through NHSBT. So we receive, in Cambridge, we receive an annual fund.
So are they a full-time worker?
Full-time.
Dedicated only to
yes, indeed, because, yes, very much so, because they will be out. We go out probably about 200 donors a year. So every other day we're out, and that might be for 8 or 9 hours overnight.
They will also, so I think his question is whether they will only retrieve or.
The question is, do they only retrieve?
No, not that's their primary role, but they'll often help with implants as well. But they are there employed to make sure we can actually man our retrieval service.
の議論が出てまいりますのハーベストの機械と食する機械っていうのは、全く別なのかなんですけど、所属としては食をするのもハーベストも、多くのが同じ機械。ただ当直のことは別々で。なので、ハーベストの当直が入っているときはハーベストだけですね。で、インプラントの当直に入るときはインプラント。そういう。
I've come all this way. I'm going to be very sad if nobody asks any more questions on the flight home.
And also, we do have time on the class.
Oh, do we? Oh, I can give you 4 more. I wasn't quite sure. Yes. Can I have my slides back up? Yeah.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I'd like to ask, why do our locations not have ability to choose where they get the surgery?
Well, it's a very searching question. I'm trying to machinate a trial in the UK where we let patients choose. But that's very controversial because the patients are seen locally, and so all the workup for their transplant is done locally. So that centre then has to take all the work and all the cost of that. And you can imagine how that would create some discord if that patient then absconds and joins the Cambridge waiting list because they want to get a quicker transplant. They can, in theory, nothing stops them, but we don't advertise it. in some respects, the answer is maybe letting patients have listing at 2 centres. But again, that's quite controversial.
I think a little bit of context of it is that, so in the UK, your original, everybody is in while we have absolutely free access everywhere in the country. So that's where the question comes from. So our population can go to any doctors, any country at any moment.
Yes. In theory, you can do that in the UK, but we don't really advertise it. And so patients can have a second appraisal or whatever. But everything is organised, although it's top centre, it's led at top, it is organised at a local level. And patients have loyalty to their own centre. So for many patients, actually, even in an explanation that they might wait a substantially less time at another centre, that's not an incentive to change to that centre.
I understand. But listening to your presentation, if I were to get a transplant, I would choose Cambridge.
That's because you're literate and well informed. And one of the problems with that would be that actually what you would do is you would favour people who are similarly literate and well informed. And then you start to get an imbalance along socioeconomic lines because you're favouring those who have got that insight and that education. So it is very controversial.
なんでこれが問題かっていうと、結局、ここに話してたように、じゃあ、ケンブリッジ行こうって思える人っていうのは、そういう情報が分かって、移植をした方がいいっていう、理解ができるようなっていうことになると、やはりソーショエコノミックス、社会と経済のに依存した公平性が保たれなくなるという観点もあるので、やはりどういうふうなシステムにするのかっていうのは、そういう議論になると思います。
Any more questions? And I'll continue on. I'm very happy to answer questions.
I'm just very curious of why are the donors so high rate? In Japan, I think people rarely wonder if it's harmful. But in the UK, it seems like most people are persuaded by physicians to donate their kidney. What is the thought behind it? Is there a cultural thing? Is it a religious thing? Or?
Well, I don't understand the Japanese philosophy, and it does surprise me from what I've seen of Japan so far. I think there are 2 aspects to it. I think we do it because we firmly believe that for the deceased individual and relatives of that deceased individual, organ donation actually provides some help and some comfort in what is otherwise often a very bleak situation. And that actually we offer that service. I personally, I would have no qualms about being an organ donor. I couldn't do what I do without being so. That's truly my expectation. And I think seeing the benefit it gives to others, it undoubtedly is a very altruistic thing to do. But in the UK, generally, we buy into that as being a process. And we're perhaps not even as polarised as some countries. If you look at Spain, there's no doubt in Spain who have got phenomenally good donation rates, best in the world. The entire population in Spain buys into the concept of being an organ donor on their death.
日本の状況の理解が難しいなんとも言えないんですけど、UK に関して言えば、この愛する家族が亡くなった残された家族の、一つの癒しですか、何か少しでもポジティブポルトがあればっていうが、家族のケアとしても大事だっていうコンセプトに、基本的にNHS 自体が乗っかって、医師も含めて全員が信じてるので、そういう冒頭障害のあった移植専門の看護師がいたり、そういう組織とし して投資されているというところなんだ。一方で、例えばスペインとかは最も世界で高いドナー率があるんですけども、このスペインとかだともう国民全体のみんなドナーだっていう風潮ができているので、これが複雑なところなのかなっていう。私も実際両方見てみて、おそらく医師のマインドセットが非常に違うかなと思います。もちろん患者さんとご家族っていうのが、意思決定の真ん中にある一方で、さっきの両方知ってるかどうかっていうお話にもなりますけれども、ご家族とそういうコミュニケーションをすることが普通のルーティンとしてなければ、家族は考える余地も知る余地も決定する場面もないというところですので、昔ながら私もケンブリッジに行くまで、実際その外来の人材大学をするなら簡単に移植の選択肢を毎回説明していたかといったら、全くそんなことはない。むしろ多少でも患者さんがご説明を依頼された場合、リアクティブにしていただけるだったら、やはりこれだけ移植と透析との生存とか、広がりの差があるということのためには、やはりそもそもの一人のウェルビーですね。を支える人として、どの職種であるどの職種としても、情報提供するということ、大事さというのは、やはりあるんじゃないかなと。
I just maybe interested. I've got a couple more things I can discuss. Because we've got this big setup, it does lead itself to research and trials. And here's an example of a trial that we're currently running. When the centres were asked in the UK, what could we implement that would improve use of elderly kidneys, they responded, the centres, the most common response was, have we provided biopsy service?
年齢が高いドナーからの臓器受け入れにおいて、一番受け入れ側、移植側の選択に行く内容は何かといったら、
And the question was, well, we could implement a biopsy service nationally, but then the real challenge was to say, well, if you had that service, how do you determine its impact? How do you actually measure its effectiveness? And the two questions that are important, are these two questions. Well, just how many extra transplants do you perform if you have a national biopsy service? And then secondly, what's their outcome? Because there's no point in doing lots of extra transplants if they all then fail miserably.
組織権を24時間の国のサービスとして投資するのであれば、質問としては、本当にその組織費に投資して、植えられる臓器が増えているのか、一問目。で、かつその植えた臓器がちゃんと機能して、生存に寄与しているのかっていうアウトカム、この2つが気になりますね。
And that led to this thing called the Pythia trial. I won't describe Pythia, so. But basically, the trial has been running. It involves all the transplant centres in the UK, and it's a stepped wedged cluster randomised trial.
23年分の移植センターで今、現行のトライアルで、ステップエッジはどういうことかというと、最初のエンロールメント最初のピックアップ。
Okay, so what it means is the trial starts, we have a biopsy service, and none of the centres have access to that service. But then at 4 months, a cluster is 4 or 5 centres. Those centres are randomly determined to get access to the biopsy service. And at that point, they can request biopsies and they get offered kidneys from elderly donors. Thereafter, every 4 months, another cluster of 4 or 5 centres come online until at the end, all the UK centres have got access to the biopsy service. And the crucial thing is, for the trial, we've got a period before they had access to the biopsy service and a period after they got access to the biopsy service. And the point at which they got access to the biopsy service is randomly determined. And we can see how that impacts upon their changing behaviour.
すごい高尚な設定で、要はサービス病理療システムが基本的には導入前と導入後の話なんですね。一方で一気に3節で導入することができないので、最初は大体少ない施設から始まりますので、だからトライアルの4万の時には一部のトライアルに入っているコホートが組織が増えていって、それだんだん全部になるような計画が立ててあって、そうすると、この全部をできるだけ短い時間で比較できるっていうのがステップなんですけど、
Yep.
で、この左側が評価項目。
Sorry. And so how it actually worked, I mean, to make it happen was, I think, a real feat. I'm very pleased it managed to happen. So the teams, the implanting team, the centre who had the kidney, they could request a biopsy in advance of retrieval. And when that kidney was retrieved at any of the UK hospitals, we took the biopsy. The biopsy was then sent to one of 6 centres we'd established nationally who would process that biopsy.
どうやってやるかというと、60歳以上のハードが判別するときは、必ずいいというような感じをして、組織がどこの組織ができる施設に運ばれていって、で、
and so the biopsy was then processed and stained, and that took about 4 or 5 hours. And the important thing was that the biopsy itself was then scanned digitally. And that image was then made available to whoever was on call from our team of specialist renal histopathologists at home. And they would look at the biopsy, they would score the degree of damage, and they would then let that implanting centre know what the biopsy showed.
なんでプロセス、バイオプシーをプロセスするところは生検体が使わなきゃいけなくて、ブロックセンターなんですけど、実際選ばれてきたら、それが電子化スキャンされて、オンコールの病理にオンラインで評価してます。それでできる24時間の。
In terms of the biopsy technique, we took a lot of time to work out what we thought was the best form of biopsy. We wanted one that was user-friendly, was reproducible, and also was a good representative biopsy of the kidney. And for that, we ended up using this thing called a skin punch biopsy. You can see it's got a flange, and that biopsy takes a core of tissue that's 4 millimeters in diameter and 8 millimeters in depth. And that's ideal for sampling the relevant area of the kidney.
どんな形のバイオプシーをするのか、均一でクオリティが担保されたできるのかなというのをいろいろ調べますけど、結局スキンバイオプシーの
And that's what it looks like. You get this punch in the kidney that you then suture. And you get very good quality biopsies that give you lots of tissue that you can then grade accordingly. So we've just submitted the results. I can't tell you the results because we're under an embargo currently because it's been submitted. But it's just, I think, a demonstration of the UK, because we have this national structure, how we can have trials at a national level that involve all centres and all kidney offering. And then just to finish off, future developments, I'll maybe just skip this very quickly. We're obviously aware of this perhaps increase in demand for transplantation. There are ongoing developments in terms of organ perfusion and perfusion technologies. But what I'd quite like to focus upon is uncontrolled DCD donation.
次のステップとして、ケンブリッジでやっていくこととしては、コントロールすなわち市中で申請していただいたからの提供っていうのを始めています。
So just to explain, uncontrolled donation, DCD donation, That's when people have cardiac arrest in the community, not in hospital. And the experience in the UK is all based upon people who actually have withdrawal of treatment in ITU. So these are people who are arrested in the streets. You've explained that, have you? Okay, I'll just keep quiet in that case. And in the UK, there's something like 30,000 hospital arrests each year, out of hospital arrests. And so if we could tap into that pool, we think roughly that has the potential to increase donation rates by 25%.
3万人の、市中のそういう病院外の申請者がいますので、そこから推測するに、25%ぐらい、腎臓の検体が増えるんじゃないか。
But it is become increasingly popular in France and Spain, and as you can see, they've now managed to achieve around about 1,000 kidneys from uncontrolled donors, a substantial number.
フランスとスペインでは、もうすでにこのアンコントロールの市中での腎提供があって、もうすでに1000例以上。
And they published, and the important thing is because the kidneys get a hit at the time of their arrest, there is a higher incidence of primary non-function. But often because they come from slightly younger donors, the actual long-term outcome is better than from taking from kidneys from more elderly controlled donors.
一般的には、市中で腎提供を行った場合に至った場合は、からの腎臓のプライマリの範囲と植えた直後のできるそもそも1回しないという例が高いんですけども、市中の腎提供を想定していただくと分かるように、一般的に年齢が低いですので、そのおかげで、見ての通り、市中市からの腎提供からの臓器提供も成績がいいということが示されています。
So we've just set up a program. And so what happens is that if somebody arrests in the community and CPR is started, if there's no resuscitation and that person does not resuscitate, they then have the Lucas device placed and CPR is continued while that individual is brought back to Cambridge with the resuscitation ongoing. Upon reaching Cambridge, if it's then decided that that person has no survivable prospects, we declare death. And by that time, they've had resuscitation going for often about an hour or even longer. So it's quite clear it's not going to be successful.
どういうふうに老人が起きているかというと、市中で心停止を迎えた場合には、マシンですね。心肺蘇生のマシンで、全部につくまで心肺蘇生が続けられた状態で、そうしますと、もうすでに1時間、2時間ぐらい心肺蘇生が続けている状態ですので、それでも、そこで心停止の指導を宣言した上で、あとは、ですけど、今回、管理施設のあったかい地で管理臓器だけして、というのも、
And at that point, then, the bumpers discontinued, the patient's declared dead. But what we do at that point is, upon confirmation of death, we cannulate and we start ECMO, we start perfusion of the abdominal organs again, just the abdominal organs, and we perfuse with warm blood that is oxygenated. Oh, you done that? Oh, I can't tell. And then, at that point then, with the organs being maintained on this ECMO machine, we approach the family, ask for consent for donation. You covered that too, have you?
管理した状態で、ほとんどECMOみたいなんですけど、管理した状態で、その時間がかかるの、
And then we can maintain them for about 4 hours in the ECMO machine. And just to see what the ECMO machine, how it works, we essentially cannulate through the groin very quickly, pass the balloon up into the chest and blow the balloon up into the thoracic aorta, so we stop any perfusion north of the diaphragm. And that allows us to, as I say, perfuse the abdominal organs only. And we can perfuse for up to about 4 hours. And that just shows what it looks like in terms of the placement of the catheter.
これがその、
Shall I go back?
エキスもどうやって回すかってことなんですけど、要は、空洞の時だけ酸素化された温かい位置で再完了するので、これ、ちょっとやるだけ、ある程度、その管理をしないと、吐血の時に、ダメージを受けた臓器の、酸素が大変とかなってこないので、その時、この願いすると、4時間とか、ある程度、管理してあげないと、その効果が出ないので、その間に、なんでああいうやっぱりのか。
Pedro, could you just explain the limits?
I think they can be numbers.
Okay. So we have a set of criteria which we think we're going to try and make it happen. We obviously don't want them to have a very long time before CPR is started. Trying to limit the time that they have them on the thumper, and we've set ourselves a target of 4 hours on NRP.
心停止からの NRP の開催日の時間でももちろん完全な拒絶状態になりますので、チームとしてなるんですけど、この時間の中で完了しましょうというのが決められています。
So before I left to come here, we've gone up to day 60, and the good news is that we've managed to attend one donor, and we got 2 kidneys from the one donor that have been implanted singly, and somewhat remarkably, one worked with primary function, didn't have to have dialysis at all. And I think one of the main drivers in answer to your question was we do it because we try and offer that opportunity for donor families and that donor to be, or that individual to be a donor. In this particular case, the donor family have already said how grateful they were that we could respect their son's wishes to be an organ donor.
これが、市中での心停止下で行われた腎臓の写真ですけども、経過も良好で、さっきのどうやってその家族が女性に聞くかという話がありますけども、実際提供されたご家族は、息子さんがこういう提供されたことに対して、非常にせめても癒やしとして福利として与えられているっていう。
And then just to finalise in that case, hopefully I provided an oversight of deceased donation and deceased organ transplantation in the UK. I think I've highlighted what a huge impact it has in our service. We've probably got the most experience in the world with DCD transplantation, and it continues to be a very main component of what we offer. But I think hopefully I've demonstrated that we think transplantation doesn't stand still. It's an evolving, dynamic subject. And I think for our ethos in Cambridge is that change is possible and innovation is essential.
今日の話で、検体提供に関して、どうやって技術が変わってきたかっていう話ができたかなと思うんですけれども、それがどれくらいその患者さんの講師先生に寄与したかというところもお示しできたんじゃないかと思います。で、特にハイライトできることとしては、脳死化だけじゃなくて、神経歯科での移植に関しては、世界に類似される。世界でも、件数をやって、その結果もすごく良い。その中で、一番早くしたいのは、どういう心持ちを持って医療従事者として、この移植の環境を整えていくのかっていうところじゃないかということを、社会の理解もそうですし、心もそうですし、この移植を取り巻く環境というのは、常にどこの国でも変わっていくものなので、やはりその変化に対して、変化に向き合う。で、そしてその、向き合い方およびそのツールに関して、イノベートしていくっていうところが大事だ。
Thank you. I'll have some more questions, please.
以上が講演になるんですけども、もしよければ、質問を受けれるかなと思います。
Thank you for your excellent. You talked about change from opt-in system to soft.
Yes, yes.
That is a very big change. And I wonder what was such a big change to become
I think it was modelled firstly on the Spanish experience. Spain has an opt-out system, and Spain remains the envy of the world in terms of organ donation. But in actual fact, the reality is that it hasn't had an impact in the UK. And the reason is that if you have a soft opt-out, despite the individual not having declared a wish not to be an organ donation, you still ask the relatives. And if they say no, you respect the relative's wish, despite in theory you having the legal right to then mandate that donation will happen. We don't have that hard approach. We've got a very soft approach. And so in practical terms, it hasn't made a difference. If anything, if I'm being perhaps controversial, if anything, it perhaps the idea of enforcement might antagonize people, that they actually become more resistant to it. So it certainly hasn't had a positive impact, and we are slightly concerned it's had a negative impact.
どうやってその意思を確認するのかっていう、意思を示す方なのか、臓器提供に意思がないということを示すのか、このオプトインとオプトアウト、ちょうど私が2019年、ケンブリッジにいたときに、まさにそのイギリスでどうするのか検討してたのをすごい覚えてるんですけども、根幹としては、その臓器提供がすごいメッカというそのスペインではオプトアウトされて、意思をしたくないという説明になければ、基本的に全員とかっていう、スペインの事例に、みんな憧れて、韓国を検討したかなと思うんですけども、UK に関してはソフトっていう、結局、オプトアウトなんですけども、実際その場に至った時の、ご家族の気持ちとか、お考えを、優先するっていう形になっているので、実際のところは、オプトインかオプトアウトしたことで、そんなにそのノーマンスマスない。一方で、ちょっとどこか忘れちゃいませんけど、やっぱりその、あんまりこう、極端なルールを敷くと、逆にその抵抗が、あんまり理解が得られないというところもあるので、すごく有権な意見案内でやってるんじゃないかなと、体感として、基本的に日本と同じような、やっぱりそのご本人の意思もあります、ご家族の意思もあります。ただそこにしっかりと、医療従事者の情報提供の場を提供してあげて、その信念としては、ご本人の意思とご家族の意思の中で、何がこの話、これ、必ず人の死にまつわるんですよね。全員みんなショックです。そのショックがない人はいなくて、これはもう日本にいても、県にいても、どこにいても一緒だと思うんですね。その中で、医療従事者です。もちろん、命をつけるということに、専念を置いてます。それでも、報われなかったですね。遭遇したときに、どんな情報提供が、さらに、癒してできるのかっていう観点で、我々も考えられるところがあるんじゃないかなと、強く思っています。
If I may ask, the coordinators in the UK, they are central to the whole process. They look at all our patients and they do everything, and they take the offers and they organise the retrievals. From your perspective, how does that sound to yourselves?
ノッツが一番の意識的なので、あとは動かせてるだけですから、むしろ、オンコールのドクターです。それぐらいになんか医師同士でコミュニケーションを始めると、なかなか時間もかかりますので、公平性を持ってシステムしてできない。一方で、看護師が、看護師っていう役目を持ちないとか、独立した存在が、仲介で実的に持ってやるっていうところで、かなりシステムとして回るようになっていて、かつだから、スノーボードと24時間以上では、基本大体そんな一切考えられない。翌日とか翌日とかまでなるんですけど、それもちゃんと引き継ぎして、だから何一人にして考えるわけじゃなくて、っていうような体制が整っているっていうのが、かなり、UK では本当にもう、ドライバーだったんじゃないかなと思うんですけど、逆にとしては、日本のコンテンダーの気持ちを聞きたいっていう。
すみません、コーディネーター、コーディネーターの高橋です。うちは、検体移植がメインで行ってまして、ほとんど、移植版という名前があるのに、腎臓内科医と医療機関の体のチームがあって、最終決定のコーディネーターってわけではないんですけど、結局、インドを先生最終的に渡すっていうところがあって、ある程度のコミュニカルスタッフであったり、周りを取り囲む先生たちとか、先生たちの移植をやる医師と架け橋をするのをコーディネーターにして、
She's only and succeeding in the big things to her. But basically, the two that look after are service private products and the legal. They, as you know, they handle living donors mainly. So they have autonomy as to, or they do facilitate the coordination between the nephrologists and the surgeons. But I guess, can they combine on two? Most of it. そうね。結局、そのを取って、そのをやり取りしたテストとかっていうのをSo, well, in reality, they only have one who did not receive.
Oh, okay.
So, it's difficult to say, but basically, they are in theory to decide and communicate with the donor and
Sure.
This haven't sense.
But then, do you have a list of patients who are consented for receiving a deceased donor kidney, have you? Yeah. Okay. Any other questions? Anybody else? Well, I hope that's been a... Right.
I have one question. Are dots assigned for each medical center who is in charge or transport, or they're one team from the languages and travel out of the centers?
In terms of the organ retrieval, it's the 10 teams that cover the whole country. But the actual transplant, the implants of the organs, that's very much based upon centres. As I mentioned, there's 23 kidney centres, so 23 centres in the UK will do the kidney transplants. There's 7 liver transplant centres, and there's about 7 pancreas centres, and there's a fewer number of heart and lung centres. So we have a service that is actually quite dissociated from, or the retrieval service is quite distinct from the implant service.
腎臓やってるとこ、心臓やってるとこ、肝臓やってるとこっていうのは、全然一緒だもう、さっき、林先生もおっしゃった通り、サービス自体は、ハーベストとインプラントで、独立した運営をされているので、実際に仕事をしている外科医としては、ある程度その場合と、個々の病院とか、移植センターに紐づかない形で、
ロンドンズ。
スノーズもそうです。
The SNODs are organised regionally, but they are funded again from NHSBT. So they will basically be within a region. So, for example, Cambridge is within East Anglia. So we've got a team of East Anglian SNODs, and they will get called out for any donor in East Anglia. And they have the facility if it's very busy to do some cross-covering and move to other regions.
地域ごとになってますけど、結局どっかの医療施設に行かなきゃいけない。それこそケンブリッジかイースタンギャっていう地域東北地方。これは東北大みたいで、一方でハーバードなんですけども、結局いつ起きるかわからないんですよね。なので、現実的には、例えばいきなり東北地方で3件同時に起きたりするんですね。本来的には課題があったりするので、実際そのリトリバルチームもその起きたときに、東北地方でも大きいので、行けるチームを差配して、だから私も実際全然そういう参加じゃないところまで出ていきたいと思います。させていただきました。なので、それを全部コントロールタワーっていうのがあって、スノッズも、ハーベストチームも、スノッズとの連携も、一つその NHS の移植の母体の中で、24時間365日見ている人がいるので、そこで差配する。当番の人たちは本当にピッチで呼ばれていく。どっかで見ている人で、我々間違いなくどういう理由でうちらがこんなところまで行かなきゃいけないんだとか、よくご言ったら、なんで、でも誰かがやってくれるっていうマシンになりますので、
Just willing to be UK son.
Yes. Is that right? Well, you've got the heads up in that case, haven't you? It does work very effectively. We have a system, and what I should stress, you can appreciate to actually make deceased donation a proper entity. It does require a great deal of investment. It's not just surgeons; it's everything else you have to have in place to make it happen. So it's, to make it work, it's a huge organisation.
So it's about time to close.
Thank you.
Thank you for your wonderful talk.
Thank you.
Meeting with struggle and big success. Both are very interesting to me. At the same time, I really came to realize that how the days transplantation medicine, Japanese. Thank you again.
No, thank you.
For talking. Actually,
Thank you. Thank you.
ありがとうございます。そうですよ。よろしいですか？はい。 Want to change the time with the opening?
Okay.
Okay. First one.